Hello, this is Community Unity Now, the D Tycoon Show. This is Bill Morton, President of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. I am Trudy Leong, Administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. Our very special guest today is Illinois Supreme Court Justice Joy Cunningham. Welcome, Justice.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, first of all, Justice Cunningham, you are running to retain your seat, but tell us a little bit of the background of how you were recommended to fill vacancy, and then go from there.
Certainly. I was appointed by the Illinois Supreme Court in December of 2022 to succeed the retiring Justice Ann Burke. Justice Burke was on the court for about 16 years, and she retired in December of last year, and it was her recommendation to the full court that I be named her successor, and that is what the court did. So prior to that, I was on the appellate court for 16 years.
Are there term limits for the Illinois Supreme Court?
There are terms of service. The Illinois Supreme Court, the term of service is 10 years.
And then Justice Ann Burke didn't serve the full 10 years, and you were appointed.
That's correct. And when that happens, the Constitution says that the justice has to be elected by the people. So the Supreme Court has the power to appoint you to fill the seat for that period of time until the next general election. And in this case, it's in 2024.
So you're coming into this election with working experience.
Absolutely, because by the time the election rolls around, I will have been on the Supreme Court for approximately 2 years. And it's I think that's very important because the Supreme Court, of course, is the highest court in our land, in the land of Lincoln, and it's very important that the justices who serve on that court are really up to the task.
So you were recommended by retiring Justice Ann Burke. She was the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. You mentioned before that you often were her surrogate, so you got to know each other. But could you tell us about how you met and how you began working together?
Certainly. As with many lawyers and judges, you participate in legal committees, legal commissions, and things of that nature. And I have always been active in Bar Association matters. And I've worked with Justice Burke and other justices of the Supreme Court, not just Justice Burke, on many committees over the years. And the Supreme Court certainly has a great deal of administrative responsibilities. So sometimes Justice Burke and other justices would ask an appellate court justice to fill in for them, and that was frequently me.
So so right now, when you're working among the other Illinois Supreme Court justices. So are most of them, are they already acquainted with you, or do they already know you from the past?
That's a good question, and the answer is yes. And it makes my transition easy because I've worked with all of them except one. I didn't know Justice Overstreet, who is from the 5th District, but all of the others I've either worked with them on other committees over the years or knew them personally, but had much interaction with them over the years.
So as a surrogate, what kind of tasks would you do?
For example, if I speak to an audience, Justice Burke often spoke to law students, high school students, community organizations, that kind of thing. And she had a speech or a presentation to give, and there was a conflict, she would ask me to fill in, because I like doing that as well.
So did she already write the speech, and then you...
No. Oh, no, it's
Not
never
that
that
easy?
easy, no. And, I really get pleasure out of writing. I write all my own speeches, and I get pleasure out of doing it because it's almost like a trial run. It gives you an opportunity to think about what you want to say, and once you put it on paper and you can really see it, then you internalize it in a way. And I hardly ever read the speeches that I write. It's more of a security blanket than anything because I've written it so I know what I want to say. And when I'm actually saying it, sometimes it doesn't come out exactly as it's written, but the substance is always the same. So I like the opportunity to write my own speeches.
And I'm certain you inspired a lot of students along the way.
I think it's a very important thing, especially students of minority ethnic groups, because I think when I was in law school, I did not have the opportunity to see women lawyers or judges of color who had reached a certain level in the profession that could inspire me. So I feel it's an absolute obligation to reach out to the next generation or even the generation after that of judicial officers, lawyers, judges, Supreme Court judges.
What commencement speeches have you given, if any?
Oh, I've given several. Mm-hmm. I've given 2 commencement speeches to the University of Illinois Chicago in separate years, about 10 years apart. And in the spring of last year, I gave the commencement speech at Dominican University to the graduates.
Mm-hmm. And you worked with the Chicago Bar Association. You were actually the head of the president of the Chicago Bar Association. And did you work with any other bar associations?
I was president of the Chicago Bar Association in the early 2000s, where I became the first African American woman to head a major non-affinity bar association in the United States, and it was a great honor for me. And in that role, I worked with other bar associations because that's the beauty of a bar association. You really have to work together for the benefit of the legal community and ultimately the community at large. So I had a lot of interaction with the Women's Bar Association, the Cook County Bar Association, the Black Women Lawyers Association, of which I was one of the early members when there were only a handful of us doing that work. So yes, it's an opportunity. It was and is an opportunity to work with other bar associations.
What would you say would be your major accomplishment in working with the bar associations?
I think outreach. I did a lot, and even now continue to do a lot of visits to inner city schools. I worked with a program that the Chicago Bar Association has called Lawyer in the Classroom. And it's a program where we go to schools, mainly inner city schools that are underserved, and we give a pre-organized civics lesson to 8th grade students. And it's a wonderful program because many students, unlike when I was in grammar school, they don't have an organized civics class anymore. So some of these kids have no real understanding of how their government functions, or that there are 3 branches of government and what each branch does and so on. So I do quite a bit of that. I have done quite a bit of that over the course of my career, and I continue to, because I think it's important.
The 2 things that I always notice that they're not really having and teaching in classes are civics and financial literacy.
That is so true. That's something else for us to tackle. That's my next thing to tackle. But I think you're absolutely right, because those are really, it's like life skills. It's something that you really need to know to have, to successfully navigate society, and it's not taught in school. So you've now given me some food for thought, a new idea.
When you were younger, I don't know if you want to discuss it, but did you see firsthand when you were a child how like inner city schools operate, and what is lacking and what might be necessary now that you have become an adult? What is lacking there? Firsthand experience versus overall just education about the situation.
Of course, and when you are in the midst of it, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what's missing until you are able to step outside of that environment and see what other kids have had and what their exposure is, and then you realize what you missed. But yes, I think that, as an African American growing up in the United States, if you live in a neighborhood that's an underserved neighborhood, as I did, our schools were definitely subpar, to say the least. And I think that when you step away from it and you look back, you see what the differences were, and that's what really drives me to try to make a difference now, because I understand that those kids, like I was, they don't really know what they don't know, or what they're missing, or what other kids who are of similar age, what they're getting in their school systems, because they do not live in an underserved area.
Could you tell us what inspired you to go on to achieve so much versus your friends back when during your childhood?
Well, education, it was always very important in my family. My parents always stressed education, and my father would sometimes say that, an education is your get out of jail card. And I think he was right, because it's something that really opens doors for you. And in my family, that was a very important value. So my siblings and I understood that that was something that was expected of us. And, I grew up in a different era where you really wanted to please your parents, and you actually listened to them. So it was just something that came natural to me.
Well, your parents must be very proud of you. When let's get to I saw in one of your interviews you mentioned settled cases. So what is the difference between settled cases and court precedents?
Well, a settled case doesn't get resolved by either the judge or the jury. The parties themselves sit down and resolve their differences.
Oh.
And I think that is a really good way in many instances to bring a case to closure. And the reason that I say that is because as a former trial lawyer, litigator, I can tell you that the only thing that's certain about litigation is that the outcome is often uncertain. So you never know how your case is going to come out, how it's going to end. So if you have an opportunity to settle it within the parameters of your own tolerance, so you can come to an agreement that this is not everything I want, but I can live with this, you're better off. Because if you let it go to trial, then you're stuck with whatever the trier of fact, whether it's a jury or a judge, what they say you have to adhere to, even if you don't agree with it. When you agree to a settlement, you know what you can tolerate. So you won't agree to it if you can't tolerate it. And if you agree to it, then at least you know it's something that you can actually carry out. So that's how a case is settled. Mm-hmm. And when I was a trial court judge, I often would encourage the parties to settle.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever serve as a mediator, as a judge? Because recently we had an interview with someone, and it was about Norman Swenson. He was the founder of the Cook County Teachers Union, College Teachers Union, and he was like. He did some strikes, and then sometimes he got a very good judge. There was this one judge that tried his. Twice that he was in prison, in jail because he was on a strike, and that judge actually mediated over the case and over the two sides bargaining. Did you ever get an opportunity to do that?
Yes, I did. When I was on the Illinois Appellate Court, I was the chairman of the settlement committee. And what that meant is there are cases that came to the appellate court, because under our Constitution, if you lose in the trial court, you have an absolute right to an appeal. And everybody exercised that right, whether they had merit to their case or not. So when a case would come to the appellate court, we would look at many of those cases and make a determination whether it's a case that was really a good case for settlement. And I was the chairman of the settlement committee, so I mediated many cases in that role while I sat on the appellate court.
So the settlements throughout the process, do they normally happen at the beginning, at the end, in the middle?
It happens, I would say, closer to the beginning, because when the case is filed in the appellate court, the clerk in our clerk's office, the clerk of the court, they will pull those cases aside using the criteria that the settlement committee has given to the clerk's office. And once those cases are put aside, then they come to my committee and we review them and see whether it's something that looks like it could be settled. And if that's the case, then we contact the lawyers on both sides and propose to them that this is something the court thinks would be in their best interest and see if they're interested. And it's completely voluntary. So if they weren't, then, but most lawyers like the idea and they would come in because number one, it saves time. Number two, it saves money.
Is it taught in law school that settlements is better?
Absolutely not.
Oh, not,
Oh,
no.
not.
No, absolutely not. You know, a lot of the practical things that you need to know to be a successful lawyer, unfortunately, are not taught in law school.
Experience.
Experience. And that settlements, I mean, they do have negotiation classes in law school nowadays, but teaching that settlement or resolving a case through mediation is a good way to end the case, it's not something that I think is routinely taught in law school, and it should be.
What else should be taught in law school, would you say? Because you have so much experience and now you're looking back.
Well, as you just heard,
Yeah.
financial literacy, I think, is really, really important.
Even for
Really
law
important.
students?
Even for law students, I think it's really important. And you have to know something about that. If you're running your law practice, you really do have to be financially literate because there are many rules governing how lawyers handle a client's money and not commingling your money and making sure that you maintain. Illinois has very stringent rules on maintaining client accounts and keeping your client's money separate and sacrosanct and all of those kinds of things. So I think a course around that is not a bad idea. I also think that these days in law school they're teaching a lot of ethics courses, and I think that's a really good idea.
And when did they start teaching ethics courses, would you say? What was the turning point?
Well, you know, I did ethics courses when I was in school too, but now it's a real integral part of every curriculum. Back then, it used to be optional. It was really an elective if you wanted to take it. But now, almost every school has it as a core course, and I think that's so important for lawyers. So important.
Did you ever teach? Because you seem like such a good teacher.
I still, from time to time, I do guest lecturing from time to time, but you know, teaching really requires a lot of, it's a lot of work, and unfortunately, in my work as an appellate court justice and now as a Supreme Court justice, the time factor for me has been somewhat of a hindrance for me to teach as much as I'd really like.
You mentioned before that you have been interviewed by 82 committeemen. So you're slated already by the Cook County Democrats. Are you still doing further interviews, or have you done all 82 interviews already?
Well, there are 80 committeemen in the county of Cook, and I didn't interview with all of them. I interviewed with most of them. And then I presented my credentials to the Democratic Party at the pre-slating process, which was in June, I believe, and then the slating process, which was in August. And at that time, the committeemen heard what I had to say, and they looked at my credentials, and they found that I was the best candidate for whom they wanted to throw their support, and I feel very grateful for that.
So the Democratic Party has a pre-slating committee.
Yes.
Did you start with the heads of the people, the committee people on the pre-slating committee?
I did. I started with I started actually with the chairman of the Democratic Party, which is President Preckwinkle. I felt that just by protocol, I should go to see the head of the party first and let her know my intentions, that I had been appointed by the Supreme Court, and it was a great honor. And I felt that the court had chosen me for a reason, because they felt I could really do the job, and they wanted to maintain a strong presence on the court. So I asked for her support, and she was very gracious. But of course, as the head of the party, she wanted to make sure that everyone was heard. So she thanked me for coming to see her, and then I went to see the vice chairman of the party, who is a gentleman by the name of Calvin Jordan, who is the committeeman for Rich Township, and I told him the same thing. I presented my credentials and spoke with him about why I thought it would be a good thing for the party to throw their support behind me, and he, like Tony Preckwinkle, was very gracious, and I just worked my way down in that way, talking to as many of the committeemen as I could, trying to keep protocol in mind so as not to offend anyone, because there is a pecking order.
Were there any unusual questions that the committeemen asked of you that you did not expect?
Not really, no. I can't think of any. I mean, they wanted to know about my experience, why I thought I would be the best candidate, and I told them many things about myself that seemingly had nothing to do with being a judge, but in my view, had everything to do with being a judge, and I think it surprised many of them. I talked about my background as a registered nurse, because I was a nurse. My undergraduate degree is in nursing, and many of the committeemen were very intrigued by that, so I got a lot of questions around my nursing background.
The Latino caucus, they do want someone sitting on the Illinois Supreme Court that is Latino. So did you speak with any Latino committeemen, and if so, what did they ask you?
Yes, I spoke with all of the Latino committeemen, because I felt that it was important to present my credentials to all of the committeemen, regardless of their ethnic persuasion, because in my view, this position has more to do with credentials and credibility than it should have to do with ethnicity and race. And I really was very, very focused on trying to make this not about race and ethnicity. So I met with as many of the Latino committeemen and women who would meet with me. And I hasten to say I did get support from several of them.
When you spoke with the committeemen, did everybody ask practically the same questions, or what was the variation among the committeemen?
It was very, very, that's a really good question, because it was very varied. Some committeemen had lawyers on their committee, their slating committee, and they asked lawyer-like questions. And some committeemen had citizens, ordinary citizens, so they asked non-legal type questions. Some committeemen didn't have a committee at all, so they did the questioning themselves. So it was a complete potpourri of different styles.
So right now, you're all done with interviews. Do you have to speak with any other officials in the Democratic Party to continue with working your way in this election?
Well, I continue to speak with as many officials and party members as I can, because I still want the support of as many people in my party as I can possibly garner, because I think that's important.
So we met at the annual IVI-IPO
Yes.
Independence Dinner. Can you tell us why you support IVI-IPO?
Because I think the answer is in the name. It really does encourage people to be independent in their views when looking at not only the judiciary but other elected officials. And I think that that's a healthy thing, and I think it's important because it encourages you to look at the person's credentials and look a little deeper and not simply follow along because other people are supporting one person, you're going to do that. It really does encourage voters to be quote, independent. And I like that.
Wonderful.
Justice Cunningham,
Thank
do you have any, if our viewers wanted to ask additional questions, is there any way that they could ask these questions?
Absolutely. Send me an email at info@joyforjustice.com.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Community Unity Now. This is Bill Morton, President of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. I am Trudy Leong, Administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Justice Cunningham, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be here.
And have a great week. We'll see you next week.